shadow hide your light, and all around seems only night. I call your name and fear is gone, and only love remains. When I just don't know what to do in this world to make it through, I call your name and carry on, and only love remains. When no answers come around, only faith and trust resound, I call your name to understand, and only love remains. When the wherefores and the whys seem so hard to come by, I call your name and carry on, and only love remains. In this world of mysteries, fantasies and travesties, poverties and treasuries, only your love sustains. Without it there's just hopelessness, helplessness and foolishness, and only wisdom comes to those who give all in your name. Whatever path you put me on, please give me strength to carry on, and fill my heart at every step with devotion to your name. I don't have very much to give, but song and dance and daily bread, but all that you have given me, I give all in your name, and only love remains, only love remains, only love remains, only love remains.
Om asato ma sadgamaya, tamaso ma jyotirgamaya, mrityorma amritam gamaya. Om shanti shanti shanti. Om, lead us from the transient to the eternal. Lead us from darkness to light. Lead us from death to immortality. Om, peace, peace, peace. Good morning, everyone. Nice to see all of you. Nice to be back in Santa Barbara after a few months. We all have to suffer. It's unavoidable. No matter how hard we try, we're going to suffer. We've already suffered. We'll suffer more. That's for sure. This talk isn't meant to make you feel bad about that. In spiritual life, we sometimes think that suffering is bad, and so that has to be shunned. That's the thing that needs to be avoided, overcome. In many Indian spiritual traditions, the goal, in fact, is permanent cessation of suffering. I think most of you probably know that in Buddhism, for instance, the first noble truth is all life is, everything is dukkham. Now, exactly how to translate dukkham is a bit controversial. Sarvam dukkham. Some people say it means everything is suffering. Other scholars will say, no, a more accurate translation is all life is, everything is unsatisfactory. I kind of like that better. But in any case, most spiritual traditions say the problem is suffering, the solution is spiritual life, and the goal is complete elimination of suffering. And I'm not going to argue with any of that. That's absolutely true. The danger is that with that paradigm in our minds, we sometimes think that when we suffer, we're doing something wrong, and we feel bad about ourselves, we feel guilty. And what happens is we're not able to learn from that experience of suffering. So the talk today is about how suffering itself can be a very powerful spiritual practice. That's why the talk is called the yoga of suffering. We all know what the four main yogas are in Vedanta. There's Bhakti Yoga, the path of devotion toward God; Karma Yoga, the path of selfless action; Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge; and Raja Yoga, the path of concentration, meditation, grounded usually in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. But I'm suggesting a new yoga. It's not a new yoga, it's one of the oldest yogas. But I think most people don't think about it as a kind of yoga, as a kind of spiritual practice. But I want to make a case today that suffering itself is a powerful yoga in its own right. To start with, I think it's helpful to think about the Bhagavad Gita, one of the great foundational scriptures of Vedanta. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the basic story, which is that there's about to be this massive war between two opposing parties, and Arjuna is a great warrior. And as a warrior and as a leader of his army, he's expected to fight for justice, for the sake of righteousness. And he's perfectly ready, he's pumped up, he's ready to go. And then he gets up there and he sees the people he's about to kill. And he becomes completely terrified and awestruck. Why? Because the people on the other side are his own loved ones, his own beloved gurus, some of his own family members. And Krishna, the charioteer, who of course is God, Arjuna turns to Krishna and says, I can't fight. I can't kill my own. And he starts giving excuses and this and that. And the whole Bhagavad Gita is Krishna's explanation as to why Arjuna should fight in this war. Contrary to appearances, which is that you shouldn't be killing your own family, obviously. But the relevant part here is, so there are 18 chapters in the Gita. The first chapter is called Arjuna Vishada Yoga, which means literally the yoga of Arjuna's suffering, the yoga of Arjuna's depression, dejection, sorrow, suffering. That's what the chapter literally means. I think one of the most interesting things about the Gita is that Arjuna's spiritual life begins with the yoga of suffering. The very first spiritual experience, in a sense, that he has is the experience of tremendous, debilitating suffering. And it's through that suffering that he opens himself to possibilities he hadn't dreamed of before. He was just going along his duties as a warrior for his entire life until this crisis came and until he started suffering deeply. And then his spiritual life began. And I would suggest that this applies to many of us. Many of us turn to spiritual life through suffering. It's only after many people, I'll give you one example of a good friend of mine from grad school who told me, he was an alcoholic. And he told me that it was only after he hit rock bottom that he finally convinced himself to go to AA, Alcoholics Anonymous. And he said the moment he walked into that first meeting, that first AA meeting, he said he had this, what he calls a white light moment. And it completely changed his life. And after that, he just started devouring spiritual scriptures. I had just become a monk in India, and he said, I need to visit you. So he came to visit me in Belumad. I took him to Kamarpukur, which is the birthplace of Sri Ramakrishna, and he got initiated by revered Sarvadevanandaji, who's the head of our Hollywood Center. And the rest is history. He's been sober ever since. That's just one example of many. Swami Vivekananda used to say, suffering is the great eye-opener. And honestly, if you ask yourselves, have you learned more from your moments of happiness and joy or more from your moments of suffering and sorrow? I think in many cases we learn more from our suffering than from our sorrow. Depending on how we take that suffering, if we just feel sorry for ourselves, we're not going to learn much from it. Here's the secret. Swami Medhananda, he would sometimes drop these aphoristic bombs, and so I want to give you one of these that I find extremely powerful, practical, relevant to everybody, whether you're 5 years old or 100 years old. I'm a Hindu chaplain at UCLA and USC, and students often ask me for spiritual guidance, and this is one of my go-to teachings. So here it is. Swami Medhananda says, the secret of life is not enjoyment, but education through experience. The secret of life is not enjoyment, but education through experience. If we really had this attitude, it would completely change the way we look at, think about every single experience we undergo. If our aim is maximizing enjoyment, we're going to end up extremely unhappy. This is something that positive psychology is proving with one study after another. Vedanta knew this long ago. But if our attitude as a spiritual aspirant is, whatever situation I'm currently in, whatever situation I find myself in at the moment, what can I learn from this experience? What can I learn? Then we can grow spiritually, we can become better people through every single experience, no matter how apparently terrible. Gita again, there's a verse where Bhagavan Krishna says, Chaturvida bhajante mam janaha suknino jana arto jigyasurathati gyani cha bharatashrava. Krishna tells Arjuna, 4 kinds of people worship me and call on me. First kind is artaha, the person who in deep sorrow, in deep dejection, suffering, like Arjuna, calls on God. And there are a couple other, I'll zoom through the other ones. Arto jigyasu. A jigyasu is somebody who wants to realize God, wants to know who is God, what is God, is there God. Third kind, arthati. This is very common in all religions across the board. Arthati are people who call on God for worldly things. Oh, please cure my son or my husband or my wife of this illness. Oh, I want that promotion. Oh, God, give it to me. I really want that nice car. Please give that to me. So on and so forth. In Hindu temples in India, you'll find, not just in India, anywhere here, we have Hindu temples here too. But many of the people, if not most of the people, will go they go with worldly prayers. And the interesting thing about this verse is Krishna says, even these people are good. All of these people are good. The fourth, you might ask, well, what about the fourth category? The jnani. The person who spontaneously and naturally and instinctively calls on God because that person has realized God. When Swami Medhananda first came to Sri Ramakrishna, he asked him, have you seen God? And Sri Ramakrishna said, yes, I've seen God. He's more real to me than you are. I speak to her all the time. That's the jnani's spontaneous calling on God. But anyway, even the arthati, that person who goes to God with worldly things, is a good person. Why? Because at least he's coming to God. He or she is coming to God with their worldly concerns instead of, resorting to cunning or trickery or using worldly means. They have a strong belief in God. That's a wonderful start. And Swami Vivekananda used to say, we don't move from error to truth, but from lower truth to higher truth. Yes, it's better to pray for spiritual things, but often it's a nice starting point, it's a helpful starting point for people to pray for worldly things, to first kind of develop a belief in God. And then they can move on to higher kinds of prayer, for instance. But coming back to this first category, artaha, people who in great suffering call on the divine. It's actually quite common among saints to pray to God for suffering, to keep them in suffering. You might think that's really weird and masochistic. But no, the idea is, because they know that in suffering, they spontaneously will call on God. I'm reminded of, I lived in India for 13 years, and I was in Bilumat for 11 of those 13 years. And one of my favorite monks was a very senior monk named Kalipada Maharaj. Sarvadevanji knows him very well. I think Vrajaprana Mataji also knows him. He's a wonderful monk, very unassuming, humble, and also very learned. He was a staunch follower of Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, loved it with a passion, memorized whole swaths of Shankara's commentaries on the scriptures. Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, non-dual pure consciousness alone is real, this world is unreal. And a great monk, as I said. So I would visit him pretty regularly. And one day I couldn't visit him because he went to the hospital, and then I heard that he had slipped and fell on the ground. He's very old. I think he was like 93 or something, or 4 at the time. He slipped and fell in his room. It was like a wet surface, and then But fortunately, it was nothing too serious. But after he returned back to his room in Arogya Bhavan, we have this kind of nursing home for senior monks in Bilimat. So I went to visit him to see how he was. And I asked him, how are you, and how did this happen? And he told me. And then he looked at me sheepishly, and he said, when I slipped and fell, all my Advaita went out the window, and I called on Mother. I said, Mother, Mother. It's like with some guilt in his voice, I could tell. So in suffering, we spontaneously call on God. It's natural. Swami Vivekananda used to say, when I'm on the heights, I say, I am He. But when I have a bellyache, when I have a tummy ache, then I call on Mother. It's the same idea. And just one more incident, which I find very touching. This is actually a lesser well-known incident because you don't find it in the Gospel. You don't find it even in Sharadanandaji's biography of Sri Ramakrishna, the Lila Prasanga. You find it in a multi-volume work called Sri Ma Darshan in Bangla, which is recordings of M's conversations with people and his statements about Sri Ramakrishna especially. It was recorded by another monk. M is the author of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. So Mahendranath Gupta is his full name. So he says one time that M is in the room with Sri Ramakrishna, and a poor woman comes into his room to visit Sri Ramakrishna, weeping, wailing. I don't remember the exact circumstances of why, but I believe it was that she lost her son, a very young son, and she's also quite young. And she tells Sri Ramakrishna, weeping, now I have no one in this world. And Sri Ramakrishna, you might expect, somebody in that circumstance would express, oh, don't worry about it, this and that. You'll get better soon. Offer some consolation. Sri Ramakrishna goes into a state of bhava, of a kind of spiritual ecstasy. And he has this extraordinary smile on his face. And he tells her, in this high spiritual state, that person who has no one has God alone. Jakyone tar bhagavani ache, something along those lines. When you have no one in the world, then know for sure that you have God alone and that God loves you. So there's always a kind of spiritual perspective on no matter how bad the external circumstances are that can really help you in spiritual life. But there's another issue in this context of suffering in spiritual life that comes up for many, many spiritual aspirants, for many people who don't even believe in spirituality and religion. It's called the problem of evil. It's a major question in all religions that believe in God especially. This problem of evil has been debated for millennia in the fields of philosophy and theology. If you just open a newspaper, well, nowadays you open websites, right? But usually, anyway, what are we finding? Terrible atrocities on a daily basis in Bangladesh, Ukraine, Gaza, so we can just name it. Here's the question. If there is a God, by definition, God is supposed to be what? Omniscient, all-knowing, omnipotent, supremely powerful, perfectly loving. God should love us. It's possible to conceive of a supreme being who hates us and like a Satan or something, but no, God loves us by definition. But here's the problem. If God is omnipotent, he should be able to prevent any suffering from happening to anybody. That's just by definition what omnipotence means. If he wants, he could stop the Gaza war right now. If he wants, he can stop the Ukraine war right now. If he wants, he can stop the atrocities in Bangladesh. Sure, we have to admit that if God is omnipotent. If God is perfectly loving, so the argument goes, he would want to prevent this suffering. Why would he want to see his poor creatures suffering in this way? So why doesn't he? Why doesn't he stop the suffering? Why does he permit all this evil and suffering that we see around us, that we experience ourselves, in our loved ones? This has been a massive problem in different religious traditions throughout the world. And just to be a little bit more precise, to bring a little bit more rigor to this discussion before we go further, it's helpful, I think, to distinguish two forms in which people raise the problem of evil. The first form is as an argument against God's existence. Skeptics, agnostics, atheists, like who? Richard Dawkins is a good example. He wrote a whole book called The God Delusion. He's a biologist at Oxford, doesn't believe in God. And one of his main arguments against God's existence is this problem of evil. It's what also made Charles Darwin, doubt whether God exists. But there's another form in which the problem of evil arises. This is for people who believe in God or in some kind of higher spiritual truth or reality. People who are spiritual aspirants. When we look at the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, some of you have probably read at least parts of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, many people came to Sri Ramakrishna and asked him to raise this problem. It's not that they're atheist or agnostic. The vast majority of them believed in God. But they came to him in anguish, in sorrow. Why does God make us suffer so much? As spiritual aspirants. So I don't want you to think that the problem of evil only occurs for people who doubt God's existence. It's not that. In some ways, it's even more painful for people who believe in God, because it's like you feel betrayed somehow by the person you love. So this question comes up kind of naturally, even among spiritual aspirants. So you shouldn't feel guilty if it comes up in you. You're on the right track, actually. In fact, in Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, this is a huge issue. And theologians have come up with all sorts of different responses to the problem of evil. There's an interesting book which was published in 1976 called The Problem of Evil and Indian Thought, written by a scholar named Arthur Herman. And the book has two parts. In the first part, what he does is surveys some of the main, he claims to be exhaustive or almost exhaustive. Like it's a very comprehensive discussion of most of the different responses to the problem of evil in Abrahamic religions, especially Christianity, because there's the most literature in Christianity on this issue. And he tries to show that every single one of them fails. And in part 2 of the same book, he turns to Indian thought. And he says, it is only in Indian thought that we find a satisfactory response to the problem of evil. Why? Because it's only in Indian thought that we have the doctrine of karma. He says, this doctrine is crucial to a satisfactory response to the problem of evil. It's really a book worth checking out, actually. So that's kind of the starting point for the rest of the talk. Because what I want to explore now is one great saint's response to the problem of evil. A particular Vedantin, a very broad-minded Vedantin. His name was Sri Ramakrishna. Vedanta itself is very broad. There are many schools of Vedanta, many different kinds of Vedantins, and Sri Ramakrishna was a particular kind of Vedantin. In my scholarly work, I refer to his philosophy as Vijnana Vedanta. I'm not going to go into the details of what that means. But in my book on Sri Ramakrishna called Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, the last 2 chapters, chapters 7 and 8, are devoted to the problem of evil and explaining in great detail Sri Ramakrishna's response to the problem of evil. And then in chapter 8, I bring Sri Ramakrishna's views into dialogue with one of the most prominent Christian thinkers who passed away a few years ago. His name is John Hick. If you're interested in kind of more comparative work. So if you want details, please look at chapter 7 and 8 of my book, Infinite Past, Infinite Reality. I'm giving you a very brief summary here. So as I said, in the gospel, you find several people coming to Sri Ramakrishna and raising this problem of evil. And in the course of the gospel, whenever this question comes up, he gives different kinds of responses, depending on the person asking the question, depending on the circumstances. And what I've tried to do is, scholars call this reconstruction, right? Because Sri Ramakrishna didn't write a textbook saying, here's how I solve the problem of evil. What we have are recorded dialogues between him and his visitors, right? So what I do is, or what I've done in my book is, I piece together all the different places where he responds to the problem of evil and try to make a coherent picture out of that. Okay. So on my understanding, on my reconstruction, I see his response to the problem of evil as having 3 dimensions. So it's a multi-dimensional response. And I want to just explain briefly these 3 dimensions. The first, it's a fancy term, don't be intimidated. I'll try to explain it in a simple way. The first dimension of his response to the problem of evil is skeptical theism. On December 14th, 1882, M. Mohandranath Gupta, he tells Sri Ramakrishna that Vidyasagar, a great Pandit and a very charitable person, he's a wonderful person, he said in a mood of pique, so M is now narrating this, telling this to Sri Ramakrishna. He said, once Vidyasagar said in a mood of pique, what is the use of calling on God? Just think of this incident. At one time, Genghis Khan plundered a country and imprisoned many people. The number of prisoners rose to about 100,000. The commander of his army said to him, Your Majesty, who will feed them? It is risky to keep them with us. It will be equally dangerous to release them. What shall I do? Genghis Khan said, That's true. What can be done? Well, have them killed. The order was accordingly given to cut them to pieces. Now, Vidyasagar is speaking. Now, God saw this slaughter, didn't he? But he didn't stop it in any way. Therefore, I don't need God, whether he exists or not. I don't derive any good from him. Sri Ramakrishna. Is it possible to understand God's actions and her motives for acting? She creates, she preserves, and she destroys. Can we ever understand why she destroys? I say to the Divine Mother, O Mother, I do not need to understand. Please give me love for thy lotus feet. The aim of human life is to attain bhakti, devotion. As for other things, the mother knows best. And so on. What's Vidyasagar's argument? The argument is, God is omnipotent, God is supposed to be perfectly loving, and yet we see all these terrible instances of suffering. He names one. We can multiply examples. Genghis Khan orders the slaughter of 100,000 people. Why? He says, God could have prevented it, because God is omnipotent. So even if that God exists, that God cannot be loving. It's some kind of sadistic supreme being, but it's not a perfectly loving God. So I want to have nothing to do with that God. And Sri Ramakrishna's response is very telling. Is it possible to understand God's actions and her motives for acting? That in a nutshell is what philosophers call skeptical theism. And I'll just try to explain it briefly here. It's often helpful to bring a number of different teachings of Sri Ramakrishna into contact with each other to kind of clarify them. So another teaching that's really crucial of Sri Ramakrishna's that helps us understand his response here is an analogy he brings up many times about a 1-seer pot. Seer is an old unit of measurement. He says, can a 1-seer pot hold 10 seers of milk? The answer obviously is no. It's much too small to contain 10. What's his idea? He says, so can the finite, puny human intellect ever begin to fathom the omniscient mind of God, of the divine? That's the question. So what's the intuition? The intuition here is when we're confronted with some truly horrendous instance of suffering, we shouldn't jump to the conclusion that God could not possibly have had any good reason to permit the suffering. if we humbly acknowledge our own limitations as human beings with finite intellects, the more reasonable position would be, I have no idea why God is permitting this suffering, and yet I believe. And yet I believe that God has some good reason, which is beyond my ken, which I can't fathom with my puny mind. But I trust in God, and I love God. The beautiful song that she sang right before the talk is really about that. No matter what suffering I'm currently experiencing, love. One of these, an excellent philosopher who also passed away fairly recently, his name is William Alston. He's done a lot to defend this view called skeptical theism. And he uses, I think, a very helpful analogy. He says, imagine that there are two chess grandmasters playing with each other. Magnus Carlsen, best in the world, and imagine that he's playing with this very young prodigy, Pragyananda. He's a great Indian chess player. Magnus, best player in the world. What does he do? Suddenly he sacrifices his queen. This is very rarely done. Now I'm in the audience. I know the rules of chess, but I'm terrible at chess. I'm a chess amateur. And I'm watching this game. I know that Magnus is the best in the world. And Magnus just sacrifices his queen. Is the right response, what an idiot? Or is it, wow, that's surprising. But since I know that he thinks 50 moves in advance, there must be some method to his madness. Surely the latter response is more reasonable than the former. That's skeptical theism. When we see an instance of suffering, the right response is not, it's just wrong for God to have allowed this to happen. That would be like the equivalent to the first response. The boy, Magnus, is an idiot. Vidyasagar's response to Genghis Khan. But the right response is, God must have some reason for permitting the suffering, but why should I even expect to understand what that is? Why should I, with my finite intellect, why should I even think that I have the right to understand why? In this particular case. That doesn't mean, now, here's another thing to keep in mind. This position called skeptical theism, this is not a kind of a complete answer to the problem of evil. So please don't get me wrong. It's the first of 3 prongs in Sri Ramakrishna's response to the problem of evil. Because this by itself isn't enough. It's not good enough. Because we still need to know, even if we can't explain a particular instance of suffering, whether it's Genghis Khan or whether what's happening in different countries, we still want to have a better general sense of why God permits suffering, just the suffering we see around us. What are some of the main reasons he might have? This is what's called in philosophy and theology theodicy, Theodicy. This is a term coined by the philosopher Leibniz. It's comprised of 2 words. Theos means God, dice, justice. So it's justifying God's ways to us, to human beings, explaining why God does the things he does, specifically why God permits all this suffering and evil we see around us. Okay, so what I'm explaining is Sri Ramakrishna's theodicy. The first dimension of his theodicy is skeptical theism. But there are 2 other dimensions which are equally important, if not more important. The second dimension is what I would call his saint-making theodicy. Okay, and you're going to find out in a second why I call it that. Hari, a young man who later became Swami Medhananda, he comes to Sri Ramakrishna and asks him, this is recorded in the Gospel, why is there so much suffering in the world? And Sri Ramakrishna says, this world is the Leela of God. It's the play of God, the sportive play of God. It's like a game. In this game there are joy and sorrow, virtue and vice, knowledge and ignorance, good and evil. The game cannot continue if sin and suffering are altogether eliminated from the creation. In the game of hide and seek, one must touch the granny in order to be free. But the granny is never pleased if she is touched at the very outset. It is God's wish that the play should continue for some time. The dialogue doesn't end here significantly, and I'll come back to how it ends in a second, but I want to pause here. What's Sri Ramakrishna's first line response to Hari's question. Why is there so much suffering in the world? Oh, this world is a play of God. It's God's Leela. And this Leela, this play, has to have heroes and villains, good and evil, darkness and light. That's the idea. Hari is not satisfied. We're going to find out in a second what his response is. But we don't need to hear what Hari says. Ask yourselves, is that a satisfactory response? Some of you, I'm sure, are thinking, what in the world? God then is no better than a 5-year-old sadistic child. Somebody who revels in inflicting suffering on his creatures. This is awful. So that can't be enough. That's not good enough as a response. But let's try to unpack what Sri Ramakrishna means. And the significance of the analogy he uses. God's play, this cosmic play, is like a game. What's a game? A game is a kind of play, right? But at the same time, it's rule-governed. There's no such thing as a game that's not rule-governed. There are always rules. Each game has different rules, whether it's soccer or basketball, backgammon, whatever it is. So Sri Ramakrishna says elsewhere, here are the rules, the basic rules of God's cosmic Leela, God's cosmic play. What are these rules? He explains them in a different dialogue. A neighbor asks him, why do human beings have sinful tendencies? Papa buddhi. Sri Ramakrishna says, it's a long conversation, but it's very important, so I'm going to read it carefully. He says, in God's creation, there are all sorts of things. She has created bad people as well as good people. It is she who gives us good tendencies, and it is she again who gives us evil tendencies. Now the neighbor pounces. In that case, we aren't responsible for our sinful actions, are we? If God gives us our evil actions, our evil tendencies, then we're off the hook. That's the intuition. Sri Ramakrishna says, God has ordained that if one commits sin, one has to reap the fruits of that sin. Won't you burn your tongue if you chew a chili? Chili meaning what do you call that? Green peppers, right? Oh, not green peppers. What is you really say chili even in, I see. I'm getting confused. After having lived in India for so long, I don't know what's Indian English and what's, anyway, forgive me. Okay, so chili, we all know what chili are. In his youth, Mothur led a rather fast life, so he suffered from various diseases before his death. Neighbor. Why has God created wicked people? Sri Ramakrishna. That is her will, her play, tar ichcha, tar lila. In her maya, there exists avidya as well as vidya. Avidya means the maya of ignorance, and vidya means the maya of knowledge. He says, darkness is needed too. It reveals all the more the glory of light. There is no doubt that anger, lust, and greed are evils. Why then has God created them? In order to create saints. In order to create saints. Mohot lok toyir korban bole. One becomes a saint by conquering the senses. Is there anything impossible for one who has subdued his or her passions? That person can even realize God through the grace of the divine. Wicked people are needed too. God has created all kinds of things. She has created good trees and poisonous plants and weeds as well. Among the animals, there are good, bad, and all kinds of creatures, tigers, lions, snakes, and so on. Neighbor, a little bit later. Then householders too will have the vision of God, won't they? Sri Ramakrishna. Everybody will surely be liberated. But one should follow the instructions of the Guru. If one follows a devious path, one will suffer in trying to retrace one's steps. It takes a long time to achieve liberation. A person may fail to obtain it in this life. Perhaps that person will realize God only after many births. Okay? So that was a lot. And there's a lot here to unpack. This is in a nutshell what I call Sri Ramakrishna's saint-making theodicy. What's he saying? God permits all of this evil and suffering that we see around us in ourselves in order to create saints, in order to make saints out of every one of us. And the beauty of it is, each one of us is guaranteed to succeed in the end. It's a wonderful game because it's a game in which we're all guaranteed to win. But the only catch is, most of us won't win in this life. So it'll take a few more lifetimes. So there are a few doctrines that are in play here. Karma, rebirth, universal salvation. And we need to unpack them one by one and explain in what sense he means them. But before we do, what's the idea? Why, he says, why does God why does he make us feel things like lust and anger and greed? These are selfish qualities, right? These are things that make the mind go down, that make us harm other people, ourselves. Why? It's an interesting, kind of startling answer. In order to create saints. It almost seems like a non sequitur. But no, what's the idea? The idea is that we learn and we grow and we evolve ethically and spiritually through the encounter with both good and, I don't like the word evil, it's too Christian and somehow preachy or something, but wholesome and unwholesome qualities in ourselves and in other people. Right? When we can read in newspapers, right? What happens when people act on extreme lust, for instance, all sorts of terrible things, we all know. And in ourselves, when are we at our best? This is a good question to ask ourselves as spiritual aspirants in general. Who do we become in so-and-so circumstance? What qualities are brought out? And in what circumstances do we become our best self, the best version of ourselves? And in what circumstances do we become our worst self? And what we'll find is, it's those selfish qualities that bring us down, that make us worse than we could be, that make us fall from the ideal of what we can be. So Sri Ramakrishna says, it's through the experience of all of these different qualities in ourselves, in others, that we learn what not to do. And of course, from good people, and in those times when we ourselves are at our best, we realize what we should be. We're on the right track. These are the kinds of qualities, these unselfish, spiritual, ethical qualities that we need to cultivate. These are the unwholesome qualities that we need to avoid because they get us into trouble. They make us feel bad. They make us say and do things to other people that are harmful. It's in that sense that God is slowly, gradually, but surely creating saints out of each one of us through all of these different experiences, encounters with suffering that we see around us. So now, the three key elements in Sri Ramakrishna's saint-making theodicy: karma, rebirth, and universal liberation. One by one. First of all, karma and rebirth. In Hinduism, we all know, even in Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, there's this doctrine of karma and rebirth. They all believe in these two doctrines. But one thing that many people don't know is that these are not monolithic doctrines. There isn't just a one-size-fits-all definition of what karma and rebirth mean. There are a lot of nuances in different spiritual traditions that accept karma and rebirth. I'm writing a book now called Karma and Rebirth in Hinduism. I'm almost finished with it. It'll be published most likely next year by Cambridge University Press, so stay tuned for that if you're interested. One thing I talk about in the book is that there's a common assumption about the doctrine of karma in Hinduism, that it's a doctrine of punishment, reward and punishment. I do something good, I generate good karma, God rewards me. Or not necessarily even God, but I'm rewarded for it, for that good deed. I do something bad, I do something evil, I harm someone, what happens? I generate bad karma, I'm punished. Slap on the wrist if it's something minor, or something really bad if I do something really bad. Hitler level stuff. But the doctrine of karma is a doctrine of reward and punishment. It's called, by scholars, a retributive conception of karma. Karma as retribution. We get what we deserve, and that's the purpose. The purpose of the doctrine of karma, of this law of karma, is to give us what we deserve. End of the story. Sri Ramakrishna, I would suggest, not just Sri Ramakrishna, but his followers also, people who are inspired by his teachings and his life, his chief disciple Swami Medhananda, and also Sri Aurobindo, and others. They defend a different conception of karma, which I would call the evolutionary conception of karma. It's not retributive. The purpose, the overarching aim of karma is not to punish us or reward us, but to help us evolve ethically and spiritually. And I think that gives us a much more fruitful way of thinking about how karma and rebirth, the role that they play in our day-to-day spiritual life. Because the idea here is, it's not that we don't get what we deserve. We do get what we deserve. We reap what we sow. But the overarching aim of karma, of this law of karma, is to help us grow morally and spiritually. That's the idea. Okay? So keep that in mind. And I think Sri Ramakrishna is exactly saying that. In order to create saints, right? If you eat a chili, your tongue will burn. Well, that is punishment. We reap what we sow. But the main purpose is, oh, wait, I better not eat a chili again. You learn from your mistakes. That's the evolutionary doctrine of karma, as opposed to the merely retributive one. Second key doctrine in Sri Ramakrishna's saint-making theodicy, rebirth. One of the biggest problems, according to many scholars, in Abrahamic religions, orthodox Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, is that they don't believe in rebirth. And they don't believe in karma. Why is that a problem? If this is the only life we have, it's very difficult to explain certain cases of suffering. Like, what about a 2-year-old baby who suffers from some terrible cancer? This happens. And after prolonged suffering, finally dies. How in the world will somebody who doesn't believe in rebirth explain this? It's very difficult. What does Hinduism say? What does any school of Vedanta say? The soul of that baby never dies. The soul of that baby is eternal, indestructible, and that soul of that baby is on a long spiritual journey. And that short life, that short tragic life, is just one milestone in this much longer spiritual journey of many lifetimes. That soul of the baby lived many lifetimes before. The soul of the baby will continue to live in subsequent lifetimes and continue to make further progress, ethical and spiritual progress, toward the goal of realizing the divine, attaining the highest spiritual fulfillment. That's the Vedantic approach. And so, in fact, even some Christians are warming to the idea of rebirth. That's why I said orthodox Abrahamic religions, because there are some unorthodox Christians and Muslims some Sufis, for instance, in Islam will accept rebirth. So now, the next question. Why should we believe in karma and rebirth? This is another question that a lot of people have. It's great. If there was karma, a law of karma, if we did live before and we're going to live again, then that's great. But why should we believe them? Just because they're in scriptures? No, that's not a very good reason, at least for most people. Can't just throw a book at people. No, there are arguments. There are arguments for and against. And again, this is a very involved discussion, and I'd have to give a separate talk on arguments for and against karma and rebirth. I talk about this in chapters 3 and 4 of this book I'm finishing up on karma and rebirth in Hinduism, so stay tuned. But I'm just going to give very briefly 2 main arguments in favor of rebirth, and then 2 arguments against, and then talk about how we can respond to these arguments. So, first argument in favor of rebirth. This is cutting edge stuff, because there's a researcher named Jim Tucker who's published a couple books on this, on children's memories of past lives. And he mentioned some really fascinating cases. First of all, one thing that's really, that speaks in favor of the research he's doing is that he's not doing research in places like India, where there's a pervasive belief in rebirth. He's looking at cases in America, where most people don't believe in rebirth. And so I'll just mention one case. There's a 2-year-old named James Leininger. He's much older now, but at the time he was 2. And in the middle of the night, he'd be shouting and having nightmares. And his parents at first just kind of ignored what he was saying and tried to pacify him. But they turned out to be recurring nightmares. And they finally asked him when he woke up, what exactly are you shouting? And he remembered, and he said, plane on fire, plane on fire. And he started giving more details. And he said with great confidence, I was a fighter pilot in my previous life, a World War II fighter pilot fighting in Japan. My aircraft carrier was called USS Natoma Bay. I mean, he gave these very, very specific details. He gave, I think his own name, he said was Jack Larson, and then he gave another person's name, a friend's name who was on the same aircraft carrier, all these things. The parents are stunned, and his father, I think, starts doing some research and looks up World War II books and finds out that there was a fighter named Jack Larson who was associated with this USS Natoma Bay aircraft carrier. His plane was shot down, and so on and so forth. So this is the kind of evidence. Now, I mean, you can be skeptical about it, and I think you should assess the evidence for yourself. And you should look at Jim Tucker's books if you're interested. There's a book that compiles 2 of his books called Before, Children's Memories of Past Lives or Previous Lives. So you can check that out yourself. But in any case, it's certainly evidence worth considering and taking seriously. It's hard to ignore. Another argument in favor of rebirth is something that Swami Vivekananda emphasizes, and it's something that we find in our ancient scriptures. Patanjali's Yoga Sutra 3.18, Samskara Sakshat Karanat Purva Jati Jnanam. By perceiving our own samskaras, our own latent mental impressions, we can gain knowledge of our past lives. Here's the idea. In our subtle body is stored all of the latent mental impressions left by what we did in all of our previous lives. They're all there, in your mind. It's this massive storehouse of information. But we need to access it. And we probably shouldn't. That we're going to come to that in a second. So let's not be hasty and like, okay, let me open the storehouse and figure it all out. No, just out of curiosity. Curiosity killed the cat, remember that. There's a good reason why most of us don't have memories of our past lives. Okay, we'll get to that in a second, as I said. But in any case, the idea is there are special yogic techniques, meditative techniques, in order to gain knowledge of your own past lives. If you feel that it'll be helpful to you, or if your guru, for instance, deems that might be helpful to you. So at one point, somebody asked Swami Vivekananda, do you have any knowledge of your past life? And he said, yes, I do, but I'm not going to share it with you. So that's another argument in favor of rebirth, is that, well, any of us can gain memory of our past lives if we follow certain yogic techniques. It's called sanyama. That's a Sanskrit term. If you concentrate on your own latent mental impressions, what will happen? Eventually, the whole story of your past lives will actually unfold. And Swami Vivekananda also adds something else, which is interesting. He says, in our last birth, the birth just prior to liberation, each one of us will gain knowledge of our past lives. Because it's only then that we're really mentally prepared, ready to handle that information. Okay. Now, two arguments against rebirth, and how might proponents of rebirth respond to these arguments. First, very intuitive argument against rebirth. It's called the problem of human population explosion. Very common. If you say that, if you tell somebody, like a friend who's a non-Hindu or non-Vedantan, I believe in karma and rebirth, they might come up with this. Well, okay, but the human population is exploding, and it's been exploding for centuries now. Where do all these new souls come from? Isn't it strange? What's the standard Vedantic response? It has two aspects. Number one, souls inhabit not just human bodies, but also non-human animal bodies, and also even plants. So, and one thing Swami Vivekananda says at one place is, he says, what we'll find is that as the human population is increasing, the animal population is decreasing. He means non-human animal population. Now, how in the world he knows that is complicated. I mean, that requires some extensive scientific research and investigation. But anyway, at least hypothetically, as a possibility, that's certainly the case. That we are noticing a marked increase in the human population, but we have no idea what's happening with the population of non-human animals and with plants. And of course, there are certain animal species which are going extinct and so on and so forth. And so the Vedantic view is, taken as a whole, the number of bodies, including the number of embodied or ensouled entities, that's the right way to put it. The number of ensouled entities remains constant. But that souls can they're mobile, and they can go from plants to non-human animals, dogs and cats and whatever. They can also move into human beings, right? But just the fact that the human population is increasing is not actually a problem, because souls can also inhabit non-human animal bodies and also plants. And the second aspect of the Vedantic answer is that this is not the only loka, this is not the only realm. This is only one of many realms in which souls reside. And so there are temporary heavens, there are eternal heavens, there are also some temporary hells. Fortunately, there's no eternal hell, not in Vedanta, at least the Vedanta we believe in. So these two things taken together explain this human population problem, or solves the problem of the human population explosion. Number one, the fact that there are multiple realms in which souls exist. And number two, souls inhabit not just human bodies, but also non-human animal bodies and those of plants. Second objection, this is something that I alluded to earlier. Another very intuitive objection. If we have lived before, why in the world don't most of us have memories of our past lives? Very good question. Nivedita asked Swami Vivekananda this question, Sister Nivedita, and he quotes Jesus, "Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof." Just knowing what we did, what stupid things we did in this life, is enough to make many people crazy. Now, if we added to that all the stupid things we did in past lives, we could be mental basket cases. Better not to know. And God in her wisdom, the divine in her wisdom, has chosen to withhold from most of us memories of our past lives because it wouldn't be beneficial for the vast majority of us, ethically and spiritually. Now, are there exceptions? Yes. Is there a whole burgeoning field now called past life regression hypnosis therapy? Yes. That's also true. There's an interesting book about this, which I'm sure some of you have read, Many Lives, Many Masters, by Brian Weiss. It's a fascinating book. And so, of course, it does help some people to gain some knowledge of their past lives, to work through certain traumas in this life, and so on and so forth, to help them move forward. But we can't generalize. And in general, with the exception of these kinds of cases, it's beneficial for most people not to have memories of their past lives, just because it's too much of a psychological burden to have to remember what you did and what you were in a past life, and then you'd be obsessing about like why I did those things, and because you have to take responsibility for everything you did in those past lives, which is really kind of daunting. So that's the idea. Third aspect. So now I've mentioned we're talking about Sri Ramakrishna's saint-making theodicy, and we've talked about first the doctrine of an evolutionary doctrine of karma. Second, the doctrine of rebirth. And the third doctrine is universal liberation. Everybody will attain liberation in the end. This is also a crucial aspect of Vedantic theodicy. Because again, in Orthodox Abrahamic religions, there's an eternal hell. Some souls, usually, will end up having to go to this eternal hell. And more liberal Christians now are saying, wait a minute, that can't be the case. Even some liberal Muslim scholars are saying the same thing. The doctrine of eternal hell is simply incompatible with God's love. At the end of the day, every soul has to achieve the highest spiritual fulfillment. And this is exactly what Sri Ramakrishna says. So these doctrines taken together comprise what I call Sri Ramakrishna's saint-making theodicy. That's the second dimension of his overall response to the problem of evil. What was the first one? Skeptical theism, right? Good. Second dimension is the saint-making theodicy. Third dimension, it's already almost 12, so I'm going to have to abbreviate this a bit. But third dimension is what's called Panentheism. This is another term used in philosophy and theology. This is the idea that this entire world is nothing but God. There's nothing other than God in this world. I promised that I would continue that dialogue between Hari, the future Swami Turiyanandaji, and Sri Ramakrishna. Here's the continuation of the dialogue. Hari, it's a very poignant response. Hari says, "But this play of God is our death. Khelai je amader pran jay." Sri Ramakrishna, smiling, "Please tell me who you are. God alone has become all this, Maya, Jivas, the universe, and the 24 cosmic principles. As the snake I bite, and as a charmer I cure. It is God herself who has become both vidya, knowledge, and avidya, ignorance. She remains deluded by avidya maya. Again, with the help of the Guru, she is cured by vidya maya. Ignorance, knowledge, and intimate knowledge. Ajnana, jnana, vijnana. The Vijnani sees that it is God who has become all of this. At the most fundamental level, the problem of evil arises because there's a presupposition that God is standing on one side and we, his poor creatures, are on the other side. Why does God let this happen to me or to my loved ones or to that person or to this country and this and that? That's always the way that this problem is set up. What is Sri Ramakrishna's ultimate response? We are God. We are not different from God. God is playfully manifesting as each one of us, as the people inflicting suffering, as the sufferers. There's an extraordinary incident when Sri Ramakrishna is seeing a butterfly, a wounded butterfly with a kind of splinter in its wing. And Sri Ramakrishna feels terrible anguish for that butterfly, thinking, what cruel boy must have inflicted that suffering on this butterfly? And then suddenly he starts laughing. He goes into a state of spiritual ecstasy and he says, "Oh Rama, now I see you have created your own distress." He sees Rama in the form of the poor butterfly, He sees Rama in the form of the splinter wounding the butterfly. He sees Rama in the form of that boy he's imagining having inflicted the pain on the butterfly. And then, of course, there's nobody to blame. There's nothing but God. So the highest, from the standpoint of the highest spiritual realization, which is what he called the experience of vijnana, the problem of evil, you don't have to solve it anymore because the problem has been dissolved, right? The solution to the problem of evil is this skeptical theism, saint-making theodicy. But you dissolve the problem of evil by ascending to this highest spiritual standpoint of vijnana. When you realize that you yourself are a playful manifestation of God, how can there be suffering when you see nothing but God? Okay? So the ultimate solution to the problem of evil is spiritual experience. That's why we need to engage in spiritual practice. That's the idea. So now, I want to just very briefly sum up the talk by mentioning a few takeaways here. How is all this stuff that I've been talking about relevant in our day-to-day spiritual life? I want to mention just a couple things, a couple tips. Whenever we experience suffering of any sort, try to see what we can learn from that suffering. The secret of life, as Swami Medhananda used to say, is not enjoyment, but education through experience. What can we learn from this particular unfortunate circumstance that we find ourselves in? What can we learn? How can we grow? So keeping that attitude is really helpful. I wanted to mention that context. Viktor Frankl, who wrote this famous book, which some of you probably read, called Man's Search for Meaning, published in 1946. He was a Holocaust survivor. And I wanted to read to you one passage from that book. He says, "We who lived in concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts, comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. Fundamentally, therefore, any man can, even under such circumstances, decide what shall become of him, mentally and spiritually. He may retain his human dignity even in a concentration camp." So that's the first thing to keep in mind. Always try to ask yourself how I can learn from even the most terrible suffering and circumstances. Second suggestion, when we see other people in suffering, the worst thing you can do is say, oh boy, that guy had that coming to him because of his bad karma in the past life. That might be true, but that's not the right attitude. It's absolutely the wrong attitude. Why? Because if you understand the law of karma properly, you'll never have that attitude. Number one, even if that person is reaping what he or she sows, it's because of that person's good karma that we are in a position to help that person. Keep that in mind. The law of karma is everybody's interrelated, and everybody's karma is intertwined in very complex ways, which only God can understand. But if we are ever in a position to alleviate another person's suffering, karmically, we will accrue good karma, we will make spiritual progress by aiding that person, by serving that person. And if we don't help that person in the name of the law of karma, we are going to generate bad karma and go backwards in spiritual life and become more and more selfish. That's the idea. So always keep that in mind. I think the best attitude is what Sri Ramakrishna said, Shiva Jnana Jiva Seva. Serve others in a spirit of worship by trying to see the divine in each one of us. That's the best attitude. And finally, last tip, let's try not to be what I would call fair weather bhaktas. They're fair weather fans in sports events, right? When you support a sports team so long as they're doing well. But once they start going on a losing streak, who cares for that team? That's a fair weather fan. Don't be fair weather bhaktas. Let's not only trust in God and love God and call on God when things are going good, when things are going well, when everything's hunky-dory. And then the moment things start going awry, who needs God? You forget God. No. Through thick and thin, stick to God. That's also what the book of Job teaches us. It's what all these great saints teach us. It's what that beautiful song teaches us. It's what Sri Ramakrishna teaches us. Right? Thank you.
Time it comes and goes, ocean, the future no one knows. And what will be is already in motion. Daylight follows night, and after rain there shines sunlight. After storm comes calm, and moonlight shines into the dawn. Today is all we have. Let it fill us up in every moment. Fill up our hearts and minds with contentment and sweet devotion. And everything will pass. Our tears will turn to joy at last. And the struggles in our lives will be our teachers. Make us wise. Oh, time it comes and goes, and the future no one knows. Today is all we have. Let's do our best and be glad. Today is all we have. Let's do our best and be glad. Be glad. Be glad.
Thanks for another wonderful song. Announcements. Wednesday, August 28th, 5 p.m. Reading of Swami Ramakrishna, Apostle to the South, delivered by Pravrajika Krishna Prana. This Saturday, August 31st, 5 p.m., reading of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Sunday, September 1st, next Sunday, Swami Divyanandaji, a vice president of the Ramakrishna Mutt and Mission and a senior trustee. He will be delivering a talk at 11 a.m. called Shri Sharada Devi, Mother of All. And on Saturday, September 7th, that's the Karma Yoga Day here from 9 a.m. to noon. And if you come for Karma Yoga, you should please join us for lunch afterward. And I will be greeting you outside now, and then in a few minutes, I'll be happy to hold a question and answer session here. Thank you. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu. How about that? So any questions on the talk or things related to the talk? Or if there's nothing about the talk, you can just ask random questions about spiritual life, I guess. There you go. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes. I'm sure Michael has some burning questions. Oops. Mm-mm.
Well, I actually have a lot of questions.
Okay.
But the one that is floating around is, it almost sounds like, from what you said, like this is all God, and we're all in this play.
Mm-hmm.
But then you also spoke of karma. So,
Yeah.
like, how do you determine whether it's really God telling you to kill 100,000 people or like Hitler, like, is that God or is that something other than God that, you know?
Yeah, well, there's nothing other than God. That's the
Right.
ultimate answer. But
so, like, then why would you have karma if God told you to do that and it was something that wasn't?
right. So it's all about, you have to distinguish standpoints. That's really important. It's really important not to mix or confuse standpoints. Okay. Sri Ramakrishna used to say, there's a whole other kind of issue here, a huge can of worms, the problem of free will and determinism. And I have a separate talk on that called Do We Have Free Will, which you can look up on YouTube. But Sri Ramakrishna, what he says is, even though God alone is the doer, God, in her infinite wisdom, has implanted in us ignorant people the illusion of free will. Otherwise, we would have done much worse things than we're already doing. This is what he says, which means what? Standpoints. There's a standpoint of ignorant people, which is most of us. Ignorance in what sense? We haven't yet attained the highest spiritual fulfillment. In that sense, we're not enlightened. Those people can't help but believe that they are free and therefore morally responsible for their actions, and they have to believe in karma and rebirth and all these things. And God has implanted those beliefs in us, that belief in free will, that we can't shake. No matter how many arguments we trot out in support of the fact that there's no free will and this and that, it doesn't move us in that deep way. In our heart of hearts, we still feel that the moment I get up out of this chair, it's me freely doing that, right? So that's the standpoint of ignorance. But from the standpoint of the highest spiritual knowledge, which is vijnana, this very special kind of spiritual experience of vijnana, it's only from that standpoint that we realize that God alone is a doer. It's only then that we realize that we're just instruments in the hands of the divine and that God is doing everything through us. And then you might ask, well, even now as ignorant people, why can't we accept that viewpoint, right? And somebody actually asked this to Sri Ramakrishna. His answer is, go ahead and try. And you'll fall flat on your face. He says, if you really have realized God, you cannot take a false step. You can't. And so long as we have not realized God, we can't help but feel that we're free and therefore morally responsible for our actions based on the law of karma and so on and so forth. So the key here is distinguishing between the standpoint of ignorant people from the standpoint of the vijnani, the person who has attained the highest spiritual knowledge that there's nothing but God in this world. And you can't mix standpoints even if you try. That's the idea. Does that make sense? Yeah, thanks. Other questions? Yeah. Yeah, for the benefit of the online audience, it's helpful to have the mic. Yeah. And some people hold the mic, but they hold it this far away, so there's no... so take it close to your mouth, yeah.
So I was saying that you mentioned that...
A little closer to your mouth. Yeah. Is it on? Okay. Okay.
I think it's on now. So you mentioned the chapter 3, verse 18 of Yoga Sutra. I'm very intrigued about this, and I know it is directly linked with the reincarnation, karma and all that. Can you tell me a little bit more about this?
Yeah, okay, I haven't done it myself, to be honest, but here's what the yogis say. If you practice what's called sanyama, S-A-M-Y-A-M-A, samyama means intense concentration, something along those lines. There's just... No, that's not one of the 8 limbs. The 8, I think you might be thinking of dhyana, that's the 7th limb. But it's a form of concentration, but it's not one of the 8 limbs. But it's a special kind of technique, okay? And it's not at all mandatory. I mean, it's just it's a side thing that he talks about. Just like with drugs, he admits that it's possible to attain some kind of spiritual experience with drugs, but he doesn't recommend it. And he says it could be a great, it can be a distraction from true spiritual life and this and that. So it's kind of like along those lines. So 3.18, Patanjali says, samskara sakshat karanat purva jati jnanam, which means by intensely concentrating on the latent mental impressions in the unconscious, because the unconscious has stored within it all of the impressions, the mental impressions left by all of our past acts and thoughts in all of our past lives. And so by concentrating on them, what happens? We gain knowledge of what we did in those past lives. That's the idea. So they're kind of like with a computer term, like there's a hard disk with all sorts of data, right? And so if you access the data, you can know what's inside. You can open files, right? Each samskara is a kind of file. You click on it, you open it. How do you click on it? It's not that easy. You have to learn the special yogic technique. That's the idea. Does that make sense? Or at least you get the general idea? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Other questions? Yes, I think we have one right in front. Ramashish. Sorry, what? No, but go ahead. It's okay, but yeah.
Is it on?
Yeah, now it's working, yeah. Okay.
So atheists who are spiritual can also say that they don't understand the larger reason of suffering or the other bad things that are happening, but they can still be try to be morally good and then build values. Right?
Okay, so I just didn't understand the English in the very beginning. What are you saying in the
So I'm saying atheists
Oh, okay.
who are spiritual
Okay.
Can still say that they don't understand the reason of larger
Right.
Reason for
Right.
suffering or other bad things happening in this
Right.
world. But they can still build good values
Yeah.
and try to be on this path, right?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, you're asking an interesting question about atheists. Aren't there spiritual atheists? And Swami Medhananda would sometimes make these startling statements. One of them is, he says, he prefers atheists to so-called religious people who talk themselves hoarse about God, but don't actually practice religion in any way. Because he says at least atheists are honest. So yes, there are of course many spiritual atheists. I think Vidyasagar is a good example of at least a spiritual agnostic. Somebody who is, I don't think he disbelieved in God, but at least he was agnostic about God. God didn't play a major role as far as we can tell in his day-to-day life, but he was incredibly giving and compassionate, humble. So there are many people like that. And yes, so I think that's absolutely true, that you can be a spiritually minded atheist, yes. At the same time, there's once somebody who came to Sri Ramakrishna and said, like, well, you're talking about prayer and all this, but how does that help atheists who don't believe in God? And he says, even if you're an atheist, pray to God to give you faith. So, yeah. Other questions? Oh, and just to add, like one more thing before we move on to the next question, we'll come to the gentleman in the back. Okay, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, please.
So just to add to that, so being an atheist, it actually helps to put yourself in that final God realization state. Because, so for atheists, they don't have to struggle whether, like, the ultimate truth that everything is God. So if to being an atheist, this puts us in a very simple and logical
okay,
state.
I mean, we should be a little careful here, because if you're an atheist, you don't believe in God. So then you're not going to accept the standpoint of Vijnana, that everything is God. Because
but
then...
that final truth is that consciousness, the Brahman.
Even that, it depends on what kind of atheist you are. Arguably, followers of Shankara are atheists in a different sense. Because they don't believe that God is an ultimate truth. They believe only in non-dual pure consciousness. So they're atheists and atheists. Some Buddhists are atheists in that sense as well. But they don't even believe in an Atman. But there are also atheists like Richard Dawkins, who are, I don't know if he does meditation or considers himself spiritual, but he probably doesn't. So there are many different kinds of atheists. One thing, I mean, it's related to your question as well, Ramashishji, is see, the problem of evil doesn't really arise for atheists. They see it as a virtue of atheism, that you don't have the problem of evil. Why? Because you don't believe in God. The problem of evil comes from the fact that I believe that there's a God who loves us and who's supremely powerful, omnipotent, and yet we see all this evil around us. But an atheist doesn't believe in God, but sees all the same suffering that we do, Bangladesh, Gaza, here and there, all those places. But the problem of evil doesn't arise in that sense, because he says there's no rhyme or reason. Life sucks, or, no problem. So, right? And there is no God who loves us, and so who cares? So there's no problem, right? So in that sense, you can say it's simpler and more logical. The problem of evil doesn't arise for an atheist, because the problem of evil arises in the context of theism, in the context of somebody who actually believes in a loving, omnipotent God. The atheist rejects that idea. So no problem of evil, no problem. That's the way I'd see it. Yes, in the back there. Shupratik.
Yeah, my question is actually basically for me, the Hindu practice, I always struggled with Advaitic philosophy and Dvaitic, meaning dualistic and non-dualistic. Like if you look at like Samkhya theory, there's the Prakriti and Purusha, right?
It's dualism.
And a God and then everything else.
Well, it's not God, but anyway, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And then even if you look at Ramakrishna's, the way sometimes he prayed, it almost seemed like it was a very child and mother relationship with Kali. And sometimes for me, I would say, like coming back to it, it seems easier to follow bhakti yoga, where it's you kind of give yourself, especially when you were talking about one of the gurus said that when he struggled with health, he calls out to mother.
Yeah. Or just, he was a senior Swami, yeah.
Yes.
Kalipada. Saprapianji knows him well, by the way. Or knew him, yeah.
So I sometimes struggle with that aspect of my religion, where sometimes it feels so much Dvaitic, even with Hare Krishna, it seems so Dvaitic, and then at times, but the philosophy is so non-dualistic for the most part.
Okay.
So how do you see it?
Sure, yeah, that's a great question. Here's how I see it. This is going to be a long answer, I think, because it's a complex philosophical question. So here's the thing. In our tradition, when we teach our understanding of Vedanta, it tends to be non-dualistic, okay? But there are different forms of Vedantic non-dualism. This is something that most people don't know, okay? Most people think that when they hear the word Advaita, non-duality, they immediately think Shankara's philosophy. And they think, oh, it means that non-dual, impersonal, attributeless, pure consciousness alone is real, non-dual pure consciousness. I am that pure consciousness, everything else is unreal. Even this personal God, even that personal God is a lower reality, it's not the highest truth. That's Shankara's philosophy. Now, many people, when they come to our talks, think that we're teaching that kind of Advaita. Some of our monks do teach that kind of Advaita. If you ask me, am I an Advaitin? I'll say 100% yes. Do I teach Advaita? Yes. Is it Shankara's? No. So now, what kind of Advaita do I teach? I mentioned it very briefly in my talk. Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy is a philosophy of Vijnana Vedanta. What do I mean by that? It's a philosophy grounded in the spiritual state of Vijnana, in which he sees two crucial things. Number one, the Vijnani sees, he says, that the divine reality is not just nirguna, but is also saguna. The ultimate truth is not just non-dual Brahman, but is equally Shakti. That's why he would teach Brahma Shakti Abhed. Brahman and Shakti are inseparable, like fire and its power to burn. And the second key aspect of the Vijnani spiritual insight is the Vijnani, instead of looking upon this world as a dream, as an illusion, as an illusory snake superimposed upon the real rope, which is Shankara's favorite analogy, the Vijnani sees this entire world as a blissful manifestation of Shakti. Not a dream, but a mansion of mirth, mojakuti. Okay. Then you might, well, what's Advaitic about it? It's Advaitic because there's nothing but God. Isn't that what Advaita means? There's only one reality, one truth. That truth is the divine. And yet, there's a crucial difference between that Advaita of Vijnana Vedanta and the Advaita of Shankara. There are multiple differences, but one of the key differences is, what is that one reality? According to Shankara's school, that one reality is only Nirguna Brahman. At the end of the day, Saguna Brahman, the personal God, itself is part of the illusion, part of the dream that we're trying to wake up from. Whereas according to Sri Ramakrishna's Advaitic philosophy of Vijnana Vedanta, there's nothing but God is equally Brahman and Shakti. Do you see? Now you come to this issue of, Sri Ramakrishna himself was constantly talking to Mother, Divine Mother Kali, praying to Mother, singing, all these things. It seems very dualistic, right? These are the two categories. You keep opposing dualism with non-duality. But what I would say is, everything he does is from the standpoint of Vijnana. He was a Vijnani. He himself said it. It's in the Gospel. He says, I'm a Vijnani. Divine Mother has kept me in the state of a Vijnani. Then you might say, well, how can you be praying? Because Vijnana, the kind of Advaita upheld by Vijnana Vedantins, is a unity in diversity. It's an all-encompassing oneness. Sri Ramakrishna would say in Bangla, Shob Jodiya Ekti. It's a oneness that doesn't exclude anything. So think about it this way. The Chandogya Upanishad asks this question: how exactly does Brahman, the ultimate reality, relate to this world of names and forms? And this Upanishad gives multiple analogies, some of which have become famous. One is, just as you take shapeless, formless clay, and a potter will make different pots out of it, just as you have molten gold, and a goldsmith will take that molten gold, oops, and the microphone thing fell. Okay, sorry. The goldsmith will make different kinds of golden ornaments, jewelry, earrings, bracelets out of the same molten gold, and it'll melt and become solid, right? So now, the question is that Advaita? If we accept the reality of the golden bracelet, the golden earrings, the golden necklace, isn't that duality? Aren't there multiple things? Yes. But at the same time, isn't it a unity in diversity? Because they're nothing but gold. The gold bracelet is nothing but gold. The gold necklace, nothing but gold. The gold earrings, nothing but gold. And yet the names and forms are real. So now in the same way, God in the form of Sri Ramakrishna is calling on, praying to, speaking with God in the form of Mother Kali, within this non-dualistic framework of Vijnana Vedanta. The chairs are nothing but the divine. Each of you is nothing but the divine in different forms. Shupratik form of God is you. The Medhananda form of God is me. And I can be talking to you. I can be answering your questions. And yet that's not dualism. Because everything in this world, sentient and insentient, is a playful manifestation of the same divine. So at the end of the day, that apparent duality gets folded back within a non-dualistic framework. Is it Shankara's Advaita? No. Does that matter? No. It's a different kind of non-duality, taught by Sri Ramakrishna. Does that make sense? Great, thank you. That's a good question. Anyone else? Please, yeah.
Very quickly, about your main topic of the your talk, evil. Is there a loose translation? Is there a loose word in Sanskrit which corresponds to evil, agyana, or is there a? I know you said that evil is a
May not be the
different
best
concept.
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
Abrahamic, but is
Right.
there a term which is closer to this? Is agyana closer to evil? Like, I want to hear your views.
Right. Okay, there are a couple things here. Remember, in my talk I said I prefer the word, for instance, in the context of Buddhism, the term used is dukkham, sarvam dukkham. And, okay, dukkham can mean suffering. It can also just mean unsatisfactoriness. Everything is, at the end of the day, unsatisfactory. Sri Aurobindo, one of my favorite lines from one of his great poems, this great epic English poem called Savitri, is, all is too little that the world can give. So in that sense, everything is unsatisfactory. But evil, if you're asking specifically about the word evil, but before I get into evil, so some scholars, they actually prefer to refer to the problem of evil as a problem of suffering, or the problem of evil and suffering, because the word evil has connotations which may be problematic or misleading or narrow. And so I think a better way of formulating the problem is the problem of suffering. But anyway, is there an exact Sanskrit term for evil? Similar, maybe papa would come close. Papa, pap. In Bangla and Sanskrit would be papa. Papa literally means sin. And so it's not an exact equivalent because it would be like evil comes from sin, right? But it may not be identical to sin. Yeah. Yeah, the Sanskrit term for those kinds of actions would be adharmika. They're non-dharmic, unrighteous acts. Yeah, I mean, look, how do you define an adharmic act? Anything that's selfish. Any selfish act is adharmic, unrighteous, evil, if you want to use that loaded term. It can be anything from a 5-year-old not wanting to share a mango with his friends, and it goes all the way to, Genghis Khan killing 100,000 people. And it's all selfishness, but there are degrees, and it doesn't mean that you should, punish these people in the same way, obviously. The degrees matter. Yeah. Thank you. Other questions? No? So yeah, going back to Shupratik's question about Advaita, one thing that I didn't mention in the talk, I was already over time, but is that when I talk about the ultimate dissolution of the problem of suffering and evil, it's from an Advaitic standpoint, right? But not Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. It's the Advaitic standpoint of Vijnana Vedanta. If you go back to that dialogue between Hari, the future Swami Turiyananji, and Sri Ramakrishna, where Hari says, but God's play is our death. And Sri Ramakrishna says, tell me who you are. Who are you? God alone has become the 24 cosmic principles, right? You might say, well, why wouldn't Shankara accept that? Shankara wouldn't accept it because he doesn't accept the reality of names and forms. So this is a subtle point, but it's important to keep this in mind, okay? The Upanishads say again and again, there's nothing but Brahman. Everything is Brahman, right? And of course, Shankara has to accept it because he's a Vedantin and he's written whole commentaries on the Upanishads, on the Bhagavad Gita, Brahma Sutta. So, when the Chandogya Upanishad says, Sarvam Kalvidam Brahma, Shankara says, yes, everything is Brahman. In what sense? And he says this in his commentary on the Brahma Sutras. He says, everything is Brahman if you subtract the names and forms from everything. That chair is Brahman if you subtract the chairness from that chair. Michael is Brahman if you subtract Michaelness from Michael. Because what's left is the substratum, which is the only reality, which is non-dual pure consciousness. By contrast, Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta says the names and forms themselves are Brahman. You don't have to subtract the names and forms. You don't have to subtract the chairness from the chair to arrive at the divine truth. The chair itself is a real manifestation of Brahman, or Brahma Shakti would be more accurate. It's both Brahman and Shakti, the ultimate reality. That's why Sri Ramakrishna once, when he's doing puja, when he's worshipping Mother Kali in the temple, suddenly he has this experience of Vijnana where he sees the puja vessels, the inanimate object, what seemingly inanimate objects, are divine consciousness. The door sill he looks at, divine consciousness. A cat walks into the room, divine consciousness. He's not looking through the names and forms to Brahman. He's seeing everything as Brahman, as different forms of Brahman. And the way he put it in one place is, it's as if I saw everything as wax. Some of you have been to Madame Tussauds or Ripley's Believe It or Not in Hollywood. They seem so lifelike, but they're made of nothing but wax. Likewise, there's nothing but Brahman, and yet, just as these different wax figurines, they're actual formations of the wax, that chair is a real manifestation of the divine. Each of us is a real manifestation of the divine. So we have to keep separate these two fundamentally different kinds of Advaitic philosophies. And I think Sri Ramakrishna upheld a life-affirming and world-affirming and Shakti-affirming kind of non-duality that's distinct from Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. Yeah. Okay, any other questions? That's heavy. This is heavy philosophical discussion. Satisfied? Everyone's happy? Yes, please. Okay, where's the mic now?
Upstairs.
Uh-oh. Okay. Well, just a second. Oh, can you come down? Or she's coming down. She's young. She won't take her too long. Okay.
So my question is in reference to maybe the ultimate goal of this form of practicing Advaita Vedanta, which is you have Brahman and then you also have Shakti.
Yes.
Do you have any sense as to why that would be the case, or what was his intention, or what was the guiding divine principle behind that?
Sure, yeah, that's a great question. I think the principle is this. Different people have different temperaments, and that applies to spiritual aspirants as much as it does to anyone else in the world. And that's why he would say, imagine a mother who has 5 kids, and she's got fish. Out of that same fish, she makes different fish preparations for her different kids. 6-month-old can't digest too much, so she's not going to make fish fry. She'll make a fish soup. For a hungry teenager, she'll make fish fry. For someone else, she might make a different kind of fish, baked fish or whatever. Likewise, God has created different spiritual paths for different people in different countries depending on their temperaments, their strengths, their weaknesses, different cultures, cultural backgrounds, right? So now, another thing Sri Ramakrishna says in this context, he says, some people are born with devotional tendencies. He literally says born as a portion of Vishnu. And he says others are born with tendencies toward jnana, the path of knowledge. Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. They are born as an amsha of Shiva. They have a little portion of Shiva in them. And another way he put the same thing, using an analogy, is some people like to eat sugar, other people like to become sugar. Okay? Eating sugar is this what you're calling dualism, but it need not be. But it could be this Vijnana kind of Advaita. But you still, to enjoy sugar, you have to be distinct from the sugar. To enjoy the bliss of something, you have to be distinct from what that blissful thing is. Right? Other people are like, not good enough. I want to be that sugar. I want to be Brahman. I don't want to enjoy Brahman or experience Brahman. So Sri Ramakrishna will say, even the state of liberation, post-mortem liberation, let's say that I get liberation in this life, or let's say you get liberation in this life. That's more fun. So now, after you leave your mortal coil, after you shuffle off your mortal coil, what happens? It depends. That's the interesting thing. You get liberated. What does liberation mean? You don't have to come back here again. You're liberated from the cycle of rebirth. You don't have any more karma pulling you back to this world. You don't have to take up another human body or any kind of body. You're free in that sense. But the state of liberation itself, I like to think of, from Sri Ramakrishna's standpoint, the state of liberation is like a many-roomed mansion. There are different rooms. What are these rooms? One kind of room is an eternal heaven. And there isn't just one kind of heaven, there are many kinds of heaven. There's a Christian heaven, that's one room in the mansion. There's an Islamic heaven, which is another room in the mansion. There's a Ramakrishna Loka, which is for Ramakrishna devotees who want to enjoy the bliss of Sri Ramakrishna, another kind of heaven. There's also a Ganesha heaven, there's a Hanuman, you take your pick. Hindus love different forms of God, so that each one will have a different room. But that's not all, folks. There's also a non-dualistic room. And of course, the very idea of a non-dualistic room, non-dualists will freak out and say, well, there can't be a room because that's already dual. That's not my point, but try to understand the analogy here. Non-dualists, they don't believe in coming and going. Shankara says there's no coming and going. We don't believe in an eternal heaven. You just rest in your true nature as non-dual pure consciousness. That's what becoming sugar is. And for those people who want that, they'll get that. They want to become sugar, let them become sugar. But never say that because you love to become sugar, that you don't like this idea of an eternal heaven. Therefore, nobody should dwell in an eternal heaven. That's Sri Ramakrishna's position. It's a matter of temperament. And even liberated souls will prefer different forms of liberation. Bhaktas who want nothing more than to lovingly worship and serve God, they'll need to be in an eternal heaven. They'll get that. And as I said, there are different forms of heaven. If you don't want that, if that sounds boring to you, rest in your true nature as non-dual pure consciousness. But better not to look down on the people who believe in a heaven, which is the tendency among people. Or the opposite tendency is also there. People who believe in eternal heaven to look down on the people who believe in becoming sugar. That's also common. Bhaktas will look down on the Gyanis. Gyanis will look down on the Bhaktas. Sri Ramakrishna was like, why don't we all just get along? Because you're both equally true. The logic being, if you accept that the ultimate reality is equally Brahman and Shakti, equally non-dual pure consciousness and the personal God, then your view broadens. You become expansive and you can embrace everybody. Not patronizingly, not by saying, yeah, you're good too, but maybe after a few lifetimes you'll come up to my level. No. You're as good as I am. But we're different people. And just because you like your favorite food is Italian, and you're never justified in saying that Italian food is the best for everybody. No, that's foolish. And just because my favorite food is whatever it is, Thai, I'm not going to say that everybody has to accept Thai as their favorite food. It's nonsense. That's Sri Ramakrishna's position.
So essentially being sugar and savoring sugar.
Both. And
simultaneously.
Well, the Vijnani can do that in the human body. The Vijnani is a very unique kind of realized soul. Because the Vijnani, he says, is like somebody who runs a boat race, shuttles back and forth between the seventh and the sixth planes of consciousness. Sahasrara Chakra, the thousand-petal lotus, is basically becoming sugar. You've merged your individuality in non-dual pure consciousness. The sixth plane is lovingly dwelling with the personal God and communing with the personal God. The Vijnani is unique. Sri Ramakrishna uses the analogy of a flute. He says, if I have a flute with 7 holes, I can, of course, just hit one of those holes. He says, that's like saying, I am Brahman, becoming sugar, the Advaitic, the classical Advaitic ideal. He says, but that's boring. I want to play ragas and raginis on this flute. That's an Indian classical term, which means melodies. I want to play beautiful melodies using all 7 notes. And he says, well, so what does that mean? It's an analogy, but what does it mean? He says, I want to commune with the divine in all sorts of ways. Sometimes I like to think I am one with God. Other times I like to think of myself as a servant of God, as a child of God. Sometimes I like to think of myself as a portion of God. And so he, in one place in the gospel, he notices that there's only his antaranga, his inner circle of devotees. Looks around and he says, I'm going to tell you my final greatest realization. And you know what he says? He quotes Hanuman. Hanuman, speaking to Rama, says, there's a famous Sanskrit sloka, Deha buddhya dasosmi, jiva buddhya todamshakaha, atma buddhya tumevaham iti me nishtita matihi. When I identify, O Rama, with the physical body, then I say, I'm your servant. When I identify with the jivatma, the individual soul, the eternal soul within, the individual soul, then I say, I am a portion of you, O Rama. And when I identify with non-dual pure consciousness, O Rama, I say, I am you, you are me. And Sri Ramakrishna says, this is the highest and greatest realization, which means what? All of those attitudes are equally true. This goes back to Shrupati's question too. How can they all be true at the same time? Because there's one ultimate reality which is equally Brahman and Shakti. So at one level of consciousness, which is this thousand-petal lotus, 7th plane, we are identical with non-dual pure consciousness. At other planes of consciousness, it's equally true that we are a child of Shakti. We're a portion of Shakti. And they can equally be true at different planes of consciousness, on different levels of consciousness. Because the ultimate reality is not just non-dual pure consciousness, but equally Shakti. Okay? And so, for those of you who know a little bit of Sanskrit, but I'll also give the translation. The famous Sanskrit formula to capture Shankara's classical Advaita Vedanta is Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya Jivo Brahmeva Naparaha. Non-dual, attributeless, pure consciousness alone is true. Jagat Mithya, this world is a dream, it's an illusion, it's an illusory appearance. But then the next line is Jivo Brahmeva Naparaha. The individual soul is none other than that non-dual pure consciousness. Okay. So now you might ask, well, what would be the Sanskrit formula for Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta? So I've come up with something. Brahma Shakti Satyam, Jagat Satyam. That's the first part. Brahma Shakti Satyam. Notice the difference. Shankara school says Brahma Satyam, because only non-dual, impersonal, pure consciousness exists. Sri Ramakrishna will say Brahma Shakti Satyam, Brahma hyphen Shakti. This is not a term used in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, but it's a term used by M in Sri Mahadarshan, that text I mentioned in the talk. I love the term because in one phrase it captures this really expansive ultimate reality. The ultimate reality is not just Brahman, but also Shakti. Okay, so Brahma Shakti Satyam. That's the ultimate truth. There's one divine reality, Advaita, which is equally Brahman and Shakti. Sri Ramakrishna used to say, when I think of that reality as nishkriya, inactive, then I call it Brahman. When I think of that same divine reality as creating, preserving, and destroying this world, then I call it Shakti or Kali. So in that sense. So Brahma Shakti Satyam. Jagat Satyam. This entire world of names and forms, all of these different individual beings, all real as playful manifestations of Shakti. But that's not, actually I gave a talk the other day on Sunday called The Radiant Light Within. You can check it out. It's about these issues that we're talking about. And afterward, Swami Medhananda asked me, he said, well, you mentioned in the context of Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, there's a Sanskrit formula, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, Jivo Brahma Evanaparaha. The Jiva is none other than Brahman, but when you gave the Sanskrit for Vijnana Vedanta, Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy, you stopped short because you only said Brahma Shakti Satyam Jagat Satyam. But what about the equivalent to, how does the individual soul relate to that ultimate reality? Classical Advaita, Shankara school, gives you a very clear explanation. You are identical with that non-dual pure consciousness. So what does Vijnana Vedanta have to say? So my response is Hanuman. That Sanskrit shloka that I read to you, it's a long last, so it's not as catchy, but it's big. But Deha buddhya dasosmi. When I identify with the physical body, I am your servant. I say to God, I am your servant. When I identify with the jivatma, the eternal soul, the eternal individual soul within, I say I am a portion of you, I am a spark of that divine fire. And when I identify with the non-dual Atman, then I say I am God. Aham Brahmasmi. But each of these is equally true from different standpoints, yeah.
So, just in the way my brain frames it is like, so the subject, the object, and the objective of spiritual aspiration are all true. In the phrase that you were using about Hanuman, it's like he's seen it in all things and forms, and in the unmanifested, manifested.
Yeah. Yeah, so God is the subject, God is all objects. God is, there's nothing but God, right? So yeah, even the objective, yeah, moksha, law of karma, everything, there's nothing but God. Yeah, that's one way of thinking about it, yeah. Yeah, thank you. Other questions? Yes, we've got one over there. Mm-hmm.
So something stayed with me about when there's suffering, you're also chaplain, right? So you sit in hospitals with people with this suffering, and this saying that people often say, I feel like personally I'm sort of allergic to it when they say that there's a reason God is doing this, or there's a reason in the world that this is happening. How do you personally, from your, how do you sit with that with people? I mean, I'm sure it's always different, but...
Yeah. No, it's a good question. And it may not be what people want to hear or need to hear at that time, right? One thing is, we have to keep in mind, there are different kinds of chaplains at universities, and there's one kind which is called a hospital chaplain, which is like Ramakrishna in San Diego. I'm a university chaplain, which means I interact with students. I don't work in hospitals. But sometimes students do come to me with, tragedies. They say, my father passed away. How should I think about it? But what I'll say is what the Gita tells us, which is, that's why at Hindu funerals, many times we read out this shloka, na jayate mriyate va kadacha naim bhutva, which means what the soul never dies. Isn't that empowering and positive to say that, whoever that loved one is that passes away, to tell the person, your loved one hasn't passed away. Just he's left one physical body and is going to take up another one, he or she. And another beautiful metaphor used in the Gita is vasamsi jinani yatha vihaya navani grannati niruparani tatha sharirani vihaya jina nyanyani sanyati navani dehi, which means just as a person, we're all wearing clothes, thankfully, at the end of the night, what happens? We cast off that clothes, put on our pajamas. Just so, the embodied soul will cast off one physical body at the end of one life and then take on another one. See how it completely changes your outlook on, even when a loved one passes away. I think that's a very positive way of putting it. You don't say, that guy had it coming to him. That's not the right way to put it. But rebirth, the eternal soul, emphasizing the positive. Vedanta always emphasizes the positive. We're eternal souls, using these bodies as instruments. So even when the body is cast off, when Swami Medhananda left his body, he mystically communicated with his brother monk, Swami Ramakrishna, Shashi, his name was Shashi. So Swamiji, mystically, at the very moment he left his physical body, he said to Shashi, "Oh dear Shashi, brother Shashi, I have spat out my body. I have spat out my body." All right, on that note, any last questions? Going once, going twice? So do you have a question or no? In the back? No, okay. All right, so we end on spitting. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Harihi Om Tat Sat. Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu. Thanks, really interesting questions.